Jesus Christ Superstar, part from the film, the 1973 film. If you were lucky enough this summer or this past year, you might have caught the 50th anniversary tour that went around. Buddy? Jesus, in the theater? Just us. We went to see it in Chicago. We had the choice between Jesus Christ Superstar or The Devil Wears Prada. Jesus or the Devil? What are we going to choose? We saw the last performance in Chicago, but all summer long, they had the 50th anniversary because the musical came out in 1972. So it's 50 years old. And I'm using the Jesus, if you weren't here on Wednesday, then you would not know that I'm using Jesus Christ Superstar, the story that is the brainchild of Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, as a guide for a series on the last week of Jesus' life. It is an interpretation of, that's where we get it from, that's where we get the whole story from. And they've different pieces from all four Gospels and made it into an interpretation of their own. And every time it's performed, the interpretation of the artists who are performing and the director there. What you just saw was Norman Jewison's interpretation. He's the director of that came out in 1973. That was Ted Neely and Jesus. And that is another interpretation because it was done in film rather than where it was originally intended. And when we research, we all interpret it. There's no other way to do it. We look at it with our own eyes, our own experience, with our own understanding of what it means to be human and live in these bodies and read out what God has for us through the person and work of Jesus Christ. So today, my scripture is going to be those disciples that are in that video clip I just, those disciples with that great choreography. What's the buzz? Tell me what's happening. They're just all over the place, and it's chaotic. Who are these guys? Who are these disciples? So Matthew 26:31 through 35. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Tonight you will fall away from me. This is because it is written, I will hit the shepherd. The sheep of the flock will go off in all directions. But after I'm raised, I'll go before you to Galilee." Peter replied, "If everyone else stumbles because of you, I'll never stumble." Of course you won't, Peter. Jesus said to him, "I assure you that before the rooster crows tonight, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said, "Even if I must die alongside you, I won't deny you." All the disciples said the same thing. They promised him over and over again not to abandon him. And yet, that's exactly what they did. Even after he told them that they would. What a shame. Shame on those disciples. They were the disciples, right? They were the ones that saw the physical Jesus. He chose them. He called them. Invited them personally to participate in the mission. It was actually a situation where Jesus could literally tap them on the shoulder. Sometimes you say, well, then God tapped me on the shoulder. But that's not a literal thing, right? This for them was literal. They did this. These guys were the witnesses to the miracles, the healings, loving grace and forgiveness throughout Jesus' ministry. They were the only ones there for some of the sermons. Some of those messages we read about in the gospel are only for the disciples. They saw him walk on water. They saw him calm the storm. They saw him raise Lazarus from the dead. They saw him offer God's justice, not the justice of the world, to the woman caught in adultery. And could I go on? These disciples were there for all these things that confirmed a life of faith and what God is doing through Jesus Christ. And yet, When they got scared, they scattered. Told them, you'll all fall away from me. And they said, no, 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 we won't. And they did. In fact, the disciple we think might have been at the crucifixion was John, because in one of the Gospels it identified that Jesus from the cross says that now John is to be Mary's son, that she's taken care of after he's gone. So in the commentary I was reading about the Gospel of Matthew, the commentator, his name is M. Eugene Boring. That's his last name. Like, I hope he's not a professor somewhere. Who's going to take Dr. Boring's class? B-O-R-N-G. But he wrote a book on the Gospel of Matthew, and it's used in the New Interpreters. So he says this. Jesus in this passage in Matthew, which is almost identical to Mark's account, so it's not even different from the synoptics, Jesus predicts that all of his disciples will scandalizo. Now that's the Greek word, fancy word, but what it really is mostly translated like be offended, but here it's translated as stumble over. Scandalizo. It's obviously where we get our word scandalize from, or scandal. So this word scandalizo is all throughout Matthew's gospel. It's used a lot. Very significant. And it's always said stumbling. Remember the passage you just read where it says, even if Peter says, I won't stumble. I won't stumble. Everyone else stumbles because of you. I'll never stumble. And Jesus says, you're going to stumble. Scandalizo. The disciples are in danger of stumbling over. Jesus' hometown folk, remember that confrontation in his hometown? They stumble. The Pharisees stumble. The believers who have accepted the word of God superficially without deep enough roots also can stumble when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word. Now, this is directly related. It's an earlier parable. It's directly related to what happens here with the disciples. They've heard the word. They've accepted the word. They've followed Jesus throughout all of this, and yet they stumble. They're concerned about things that Jesus is not concerned about. He's trying to tell them in the Jesus Christ Superstar, snippet and What's the Buzz, he's trying to tell them, this is not what it's about. You're not thinking right. Why are you obsessed with fighting? The disciples stumbled. They weren't there when they said they would be. And Jesus told them they wouldn't be. They denied it, and then they did it anyway. And that brings us to what Jesus is saying in this passage. And Jesus predicts how this will happen to all the disciples who stumble at the prospect of a Christ who chooses to be crucified rather than to retaliate. And that, I think, is the one thing that sticks with them. They can't get over that. It's really brought out by the artists in the play, the musical, what is it called, rock opera, Jesus Christ Superstar, that these disciples have an agenda that is retributive justice, and God has an agenda to Jesus Christ that's restorative justice. Jesus chooses to be crucified rather than retaliate. Matthew, always intent upon presenting Jesus as a Messiah, has Jesus making a prediction that essentially says God will strike him down. He's the shepherd. And the sheep will scatter. The sheep being the disciples and the followers. He says that to them. And they, oh, no, that won't happen. I promise. So if those who were actually there with Jesus, getting tapped on the shoulder physically, who had given up everything to follow Jesus and have witnessed to his ministry, if those then scatter out of fear or uncertainty or lack of courage, what does that say for us? Uh-oh. We might be in a little bit of trouble. in the 1973 as well as the stage performance, the disciples are depicted as this ragtag group of revolutionaries and dressed like hippies. And during the song, What's the Buzz, they seem to be getting ahead of themselves. And Jesus has to bring them back into focus. And I hate this treatment of disciples. I do. And I'll tell you why. If you look at art and writing throughout history, the disciples are always depicted as the most saintly of men. Those who perfectly represent what it means to be a follower of Jesus. They are hallowed as such. Now, I'm not here to say that those are necessarily wrong. The disciples have a pivotal, essential, and important role to play in the establishment of our faith, spreading of Christianity at the very beginning. But could anyone ever perfectly represent what it means to be a follower of Jesus? And if the disciples are so lifted up, what does that mean that they abandon Jesus in his desperate hours? I think we just forget. And those people, frescoes in Rome, they forgot about this part. If those close to Jesus, those so important to the faith, can get it wrong, what does that mean for us? And this is why I like it, because for us it means grace. It means we have a chance with Jesus. If they can be the central people and still abandon him in his hour of need and scatter to the wind, what does that mean for us? He brought them back together after the resurrection. Do you not think Jesus will bring you back from wherever you're going or wherever you've been? The disciples' frailty and fallibility opens windows. It cracks the door ajar and lets us in, gives us access to the kingdom. If we can identify with those disciples, we talked about it on Wednesday night, not many people can identify with Pilate. None of us are like, procurators of occupied areas. But those disciples and their frailty, making promises that they didn't make good on, if they can be included as such, then the door is cracked open for us. We have access to the kingdom. No matter who we are, right where we are. Because we make mistakes as individuals and collectively. And one of the mistakes is that we fail to learn this lesson about who Jesus is. And instead of taking Jesus as a person of grace who includes disciples who fall away and go wayward, we make a church that has a whole bunch of barriers and rules and lines and delineations against who is out and who is in. The big mistake of the church is that the church draws boundaries, these visible lines, and makes these moral rules and tells us who is in and who is out. And the church throughout history has developed whole theologies to support really evil things in the world based on us. Even our approach to evangelism has this thing about, I have a special knowledge. I am up here, and I will impart that knowledge to you, and you too shall be saved. Instead of what I love about evangelism, it's two beggars, right? One of them knows where the bread is. But this is a big mistake of the church throughout history. Christianity, at least the faith of the followers and the teachings of Jesus, ought to be the opposite of this superiority the church often has. In 1998, a book entitled When the Church Bell Rang Racist was published. The title of the book is The Methodist Church and the Civil Rights Movement in Alabama. The book book by Donald Collins is part autobiography and in part a work of personal interviews with more than 50 Methodist ministers who served in and around the West Florida and Alabama conference. We have different conferences. In the 50s and the 60s. In his book, Collins tells of the lack of leadership to counter segregationists in the church. In the church, not the community, in the church. And the harassment hurled at clergy, any clergy, who supported civil rights. It's not about the racism of the white church. It's about the racism of the white Methodist church. It's about more than 40 pastors, including Collins himself, leaving the ministry entirely, leaving the southeastern United States for greener pastures. Scattering. But glory be, the good ones must have stayed. And how can we judge those that left? How can we judge those disciples for abandoning Jesus? How can we stand here in history now and judge the past? How can we judge those who failed to stand up in the face of adversity? Unless we're confident we're able to do so, unless we're tested. We don't know. The Methodist Church certainly hasn't fixed everything that's wrong with it, but we're on a path. Any follower of Jesus tries, as the disciples tried, you know, we get better. The disciples did get better. Jesus brought them back in after the resurrection. He told them he'd go ahead of them to Galilee and bring them back in. He brought them back in and they became apostles. They got better. They went in the right direction. And even though they scattered when he needed them most, he redeemed them in the end. They were so scared when he first met them that they were holed up in a locked room. And locked doors were nothing for the resurrected Lord, so he disappeared among them. But they were so scared, they were locked in. I tell you, friends, this morning, if you identify at all, what's the buzz? With these flip-flopping, sometimes faithful, sometimes not, ragtag of hippies, take heart. You're one of Jesus' precious inner circle. You have access to that kingdom.